Hello, and we are live from All Aces on Air, and I want to welcome everybody who's attending today. My name is John Monahan. I'm the Director of Partnerships for All Aces. I'm also a retired police chief who has been fortunate enough to work with All Aces, a racial equity, diversity, and inclusion firm out of Boston. Behind the scenes is Miles Green and Enrico Manalo, who are going to be helping us with our program today. And I want to say thank you to them ahead of time for their hard work that we will not be noticing because their faces aren't with us. So today we've got a roundtable discussion with three folks who joined us individually before. We've got Professor Marie Breen-Smyth, Dr. Tracie Keesee, Dr. Atyia Martin, and Ashok Panikkar. They are joining us for a four-person discussion just to see kind of where things are at in the world. And before we get started with that, I just want to kind of do a recap. In the first episode, we talked with Dr. Keesee and Dr. Ross and Dr. Martin about what is sort of police reform and the co-production of new public safety look like. We talked about dialogue and its use in conflict resolution, and how to even have a discussion about where we need to go. And then in our second gathering, we talked with Ashok, who uses critical thinking skills in his social justice and conflict resolution work to help bring opposing sides together to have meaningful and productive conversations. And we had Atyia with us again because she is the president and CEO of All Aces Inc. and our think tank person. So, and in our final episode, we spoke with Professor Marie Breen-Smyth, who has encouraged me to call her Marie for the remainder of our broadcast. And we talked with her about her work in South Africa, in Northern Ireland, in how they reformed their police culture there to be one of service to their communities when it had been one of oppression. And so today we've gathered them together, and we're hoping just to sort of see. It's been 3 months since George Floyd was murdered. And since then, we've seen protests, we've seen all kinds of varying police responses, and we've seen more shootings. And unfortunately, just recently, Jacob Blake was shot in the back in Wisconsin. And so I'd like to, before we really dive into that, just get a feel from each of you. Dr. Keesee is from the Center of Policing Equity, based out of John Jay College in New York. I'd love to hear how your summer's been going, how you're doing, and then we'll move on to each person and just do a check-in and see what you've been up to.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the invitation, for being here, and for the check-in question. I certainly will speak for myself. I'm exhausted. It is the work that we do. I think most of us on the screen that know it requires a high level of engagement, and it's exhausting. And so I've really been trying to practice some self-care here over the summer. I'm intrigued by the varying responses that I've been seeing across the country. And I think we're all sort of waiting to see eventually what will happen and what we will be talking about when we talk about public safety versus policing. So I appreciate your question. And I would be remiss if I did not shout out the fact that my granddaughter got her braces off today. And so the world is right again.
That's great. Thank you. Ashok, what have you been up to? I know that you had a small vacation this summer and you, in addition to your work.
Yeah, well, thank you, John and Dr. Atyia and Rico for having me back. I have to say that, like Dr. Keesee, I'm exhausted. And it's a funny thing because it's just 4 days since I came back from Vermont. And I'm exhausted because, well, apart from the fact that it wasn't a pure vacation, I've been running my webinars and doing a bunch of things. So I never really just shut everything down. But it's more than that. And there's nothing special about the way I'm feeling. In fact, compared to someone like Dr. Keesee, who's been working very, very closely with the police, and I can only imagine how intense that is. I mean, my work is with ordinary people, and it's really, at this point in time, because of COVID, it's purely education. And yet, every time I talk with people, and these are really good, um, well-meaning people who are hurting so much and they want to make a difference, I find that they are battling so much of hopelessness and so much of their own frustration and even anger that it's heartbreaking. I've never had to teach about vital issues or anything else for that matter under these emotional conditions. So it's literally like trying to teach someone about philosophy or politics in the middle of in a refugee camp. It feels like we are all not even immigrants now, we are refugees, and that the center hasn't helped, and it's a very, very difficult time. And I've never slept well, so I do my sleep patterns can actually be a fairly good barometer, and it's been rough. But thank you for asking, John.
Sure. Sure. Thank you for telling us all that, Ashok. I can't imagine how people, and hopefully we'll get to what people can do from you all about steps that ordinary folks can take. Marie, how are you? You are coming to us from, I'm going to try to, Bloody Foreland, Ireland, or somewhere near, a sheep pasture near there, from what I understand.
That's right. I'm in the middle of nowhere. I'm surrounded by sheep and rocks and bogland. And it's a very remote area, and I live here because I like to get away from it all after a long life of being in the thick of it. And I'm listening to you all with great concern because I feel the frustration and the burdens that you're carrying. And I mean, for me, having lived through 40 years of a war here in Ireland, I just want to offer you a thought, which is, people, hopelessness is a terrible energy sap. It drains your energy, I think, and when we were in the middle of things here, I used to tell my students that hope was not so much a feeling, but a discipline and a practice. That you act as if you feel hope. You don't feel it. Of course you don't feel it. But somehow if you manage to break through that barrier, somehow you can generate hope. You can make it happen. And I just want to offer you that thought, because how I am, I'm fine. I'm living the good life here with my sheep. And I'm writing, and I'm doing a building project, and I'm doing all sorts of things. But my heart is back in Boston with you guys, and it's back in the United States with all the struggles that you face. Not that we don't have our own struggles here, but yours is pivotal, I think, for so many people in the world. So many people are watching what's going on there, and keeping our fingers and our toes crossed for what happens in November. And I'll talk about that in a little while. But basically, I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with me.
That's good to hear. Thank you. And we are practicing what we call collective care weeks right now at All ACEs, which is one of our values, that we take time to regenerate ourselves and work on passion projects and catch up and make sure we take care of each other and our organization. And so I'd like to ask Dr. Martin how she's been doing during collective care weeks. What have you been up to? How have you been feeling?
I've actually, I think I'm still pretty status quo at this point, which is for those who've asked me how I'm doing, I generally say the same thing, which is I'm a walking contradiction. I am incredibly energized and incredibly exhausted all at the same time. And for me, this summer has been hectic. In some ways, in difficult ways, and in other ways in very hopeful and positive and exciting ways. And so, part of that is the work that we do with clients, and in being able to, just like we do with collective care weeks, live into our values, right? And so being able to kind of stay in it with folks, and at the same time, some of the community organizing and community partnership work that I'm involved in for Boston. And so, that's a whole nother insight into the way that racism plays out in all of the extra work that has to be done for basic stuff. That's not, not even, no one's asking for any favors, just asking for like the basics, bare minimum stuff. And so that can be challenging. We've had some wins over the summer that have been really exciting. And in dealing with the ongoing challenges of what it means to try to get your return on investment back from institutions and organizations that have not done so and have not been accountable. And then the last thing I'll say is I'm always hopeful. It's not, for me, my exhaustion isn't about not being hopeful. It's been hectic, and it's the work filtering out people and organizations who think they get it but don't and aren't really ready to kind of do the kind of work that we do with organizations. They want the, let's have a conversation, can you facilitate a discussion, and then magically we can check that box. And so that is exhausting, right? Because it's like being in constant productive conflict, which productive conflict is good. It's just, it's tiring. And then I think the other reason is separate from the work. I'm a human being, and it's part of my identity as a human being. I'm a Black woman. And so a lot of the what we're seeing, whether it's on the law enforcement side of the house and criminal justice system, or whether it's COVID-19's disproportionate burdens, I personally am impacted by those things. And so always trying to be in touch with how I'm feeling in any given moment, so that I can manage myself, but also step back when it's too much. So that's been the summer. And on the bright side, my family as well. We have 5 children, 2 still at home. My 2 youngest are 12 and 16, and they are, it's fun to spend this much time with them. Not as much as I would like to, actually, but it has been fun to spend time with them and see how they're evolving and have really sophisticated conversations with them, and just see like how they're maturing and processing the world and seeing themselves in the world, and all of the intentionality we tried to put into the way we try to raise Black children in a society that's not designed for them to thrive. So overall, incredibly hopeful.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. And we are all coming from our home. So if there are kids that show up in the background, as I've seen them walk in on Dr. Martin on occasion, or my dog pops into the screen, or whatever may happen, that's COVID, and that's life is real. So we'll just put that caveat out there. So it has been 3 months since we started this whole journey together, and you all have, in varying ways, been involved with this work. And I'm curious what you're seeing, what you're feeling, or how you're feeling about it, how you've seen things evolve or change for better or for worse, and how does that make you feel, and just where are you with the work professionally? And please feel free. I'd love to just hear y'all talk with one another about ideas you may have, things that came up from our last discussions, and things that we've seen evolve since we last talked. Dr. Keesee, you're right in the thick of it.
It's a loaded question. So I have to think about this. So we're a couple months past George Floyd's homicide. We still have a community that is grieving. They're in different stages of grief depending on where you are and what's happening around you, and the ability to get away, right? So if you are in some cities and states where social distancing is still being really heavily enforced, or you're in just a living space where you can't. It creates an entirely different sort of dynamic for people who want to get outside. And I truly believe I've always believed this, there's something about the human touch that we just can't be without. It is just what it is. I would tell you that I have had and just this week, and today is Wednesday, I think, several calls with large groups of folks. We do the same thing. We have the triage. We have people who want to get through this moment and get to the other side because it's uncomfortable. And they don't want to have to do the work to really realize what is happening around them. And so we've spent a lot of time, I say over the last 3 months, really trying to drill down and to create a process that helps actually filter some of that out. And I think what's the struggle for me right now is that this is not only not that moment where you can just check that box, this is a leadership moment. And we're finding that there's also gaps in leadership to get folks through this moment. And I think it's very interesting to see leaders who are also struggling because they don't have the words, they don't have the direction to begin to try to figure out what do those approaches look like. In policing, you still have officers who don't understand what's going on. They too are in some similarities to community. There is confusion, there is grieving, there is lots of things happening that they just can't seem to wrap their minds around. So that requires a space for that to be lifted up so you can begin to do some of this work. And so really the last month has been sitting with chiefs and other city administrators and legislators to really get them to start to think about reacting is not the solution of the moment, that you have to really be long-term and strategic about what we are trying to do, and trying to rush to the other side is not going to solve for what the problem is here. And so I'm really struggling for those chiefs on their behalf with all the different legislation and ordinances that have come down to try to solve legislatively what is a human problem historically. And it is just added a new dynamic to the challenge. And so I think that for me, it is really balancing that work and really having to encourage people, much like we discussed it in our check-in, that you've got to have a healthcare plan for the pervasive generational trauma. And that is a big piece missing right now. And so it's all that and more, but at least people are moving. They're trying to make some initial decisions about what that first step is. And we still have a lot of people who have not even begun to address it. And we have some people who are genuinely paralyzed and they just can't get out of this and they don't know what to do and where to go. And we have some other folks that are just moving right along. They are engaging their people, they're listening, they're hearing, they're trying to practice, self-care, they're trying to learn and educate. They're not asking people of color to educate them. So, we're gonna get there. It's gonna take some time. I managed a lot of expectations over the last few months. Managed a lot of expectations.
I can just imagine. I can just imagine. So anybody else who would like to jump in, you're welcome to. This is if that spawns a thought for you, feel free to jump in. We don't have
Great.
to
Well,
this.
I'll just share where I'm coming from. And here's my challenge. One, I'm not an American, even though I've lived here for almost 15 years. And two, a lot of the work, like Marie, a lot of the work that I have done is internationally, though in my case also a lot in the US. And of late, particularly as I probably mentioned in my last session with you folks, over the past 10 years, I have become so terrified about the impact of polarization and the impact of the economy and all other major factors on the political system. And when I say political system, I'm not talking of the political system of autocratic countries. I'm not talking of China. I'm not talking of Saudi Arabia or, even Singapore. I'm talking of democratic countries. And so here's my challenge. The greater the polarization in these countries, the weaker the political system becomes. And I have watched, unfortunately, very intimately over a span of about 15 years, how India has almost lost its democracy. And the group that I worked most closely with in India were Muslims, who are 150 million, but who are also about 15% of the population. And I can see how aggressive advocacy on behalf of Muslims 10, 15 years ago contributed to the weakening of democratic norms like freedom of speech. Um, uh, and to such an extent that the right wing in India was able to leverage all the weaknesses inherent in a liberal democratic system to make it illiberal and to take over the reins of the system, to the extent that today Muslims cannot expect any of the rights that they had even 5 to 10 years ago. It's a complete change, a sea change, and a very dangerous one. Now, but I'm also very concerned about the way in which the right wing has risen all across the world, and whether it's AFD in Germany, or whether it's the illiberal democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, I'm really nervous that the kind of assumptions that many of us have and had around which minority rights could be framed are disappearing. And I'm just trying to put it out there that I've lived in the Arab Gulf, and I've lived as a brown man, a non-Muslim, and an Indian. And in countries like that, there are no two things. I am a fourth or fifth class citizen. Not even a citizen. I'm just an outsider and a fourth or fifth class human being. Okay, it's so blatant. And I have experienced that from the 70s and 80s, and now it's even worse in many ways. And I've also watched India lose its democracy from 1975 to 77, and I saw what that means for human rights writ large, for even the right of an individual from a dominant or majority community, leave alone a minority. And so when I look at the US, that it's not unique. What's happening in the US is not unique at all. It's part of a series of tensions that are tearing apart the liberal world order. And I guess for most of us, we've grown up in this post-World War II era. And so we've kind of probably taken it for granted. And I am terrified again. And not being American, I don't have to feel optimistic, even if I don't feel like it. I am absolutely okay saying I have never been so scared in my life. Not sometimes for me personally, but really it's for our children. It's for what we leave behind. And I don't know how we can balance increased advocacy for minority rights with even as the very assumptions and the structures that have been put in place to protect minority rights are being washed away. And that's the tension that I'm feeling. And I certainly have no answers. And I'm hoping that the three of you, working on issues like this for a long period of time, will have some, wisdom and insights for me. Yeah, this is the balance. The larger geopolitical situation, the fact that liberalism at multiple levels may have outrun its course or outlived its course, and the extraordinary backlash from the right all over the world. It's not just white folks in the south of the US, or it's not white men. It is, everything is changing in terms of minority-majority relations worldwide. So I'll hand it to you folks now to help me out.
Thank you, Ashok. Dr. Martin and I have had a lot of discussions about the power dynamics that we see play out, and how do you make that change? And part of it is personal, and part of it is systemic. And we talked a lot about people who have a high degree of emotional intelligence. They tend to be able to learn new ways of being, see the benefit of making sure that minority populations are equally represented, even though maybe they didn't grow up that way, but they have a better way to understand that. But then in our talk with Marie, she's talked about sometimes you just got to create a structure where you can root out people that are doing harm to others. And I'm just curious. Part of it, I think, is a personal level, and I think part of it's a structural level. And I don't know if that strikes any thoughts for you all.
I mean,
well,
from me, there she goes. Go ahead, Marie. You're in there. You started.
Okay. I've been thinking about this. I had to do a long drive today because I had to pick up some building supplies. And I was thinking about you guys and where you are and what it looks like from my little outpost here on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. And I think I'm echoing some of the things that was said earlier about leadership, because I'm really worried about leadership. And I think I ended up thinking that there were 4 things that I needed to say in this broadcast. So let me run through them really quickly. And the first one is to do with leadership. And I think that, and it's also to do with strategy as well. I mean, what do you do if you're living in the United States and you want to see change and you recognize the urgency for change and so on? And for me, the first priority has to be November, and it has to be who's going into the White House, because it seems to me that if we are looking at another 4 years of Donald Trump, that's going to put the kibosh on all sorts of opportunities for change in the near future. So I think that, and I'm not a fan of the Democrats. I'm not a fan of Biden, but I do think that Trump is a leader who's leading in the opposite direction of anything that any of us want to see happen. So I think that's first and foremost, I think the thing that sticks out for me as a priority, and I can't get past that, really. The second thing is that in terms of strategy, and I'm reflecting on both what happened in Northern Ireland, but also in South Africa, to a lesser extent what's happening in Israel-Palestine, because I'm quite hopeless about that at the moment. And I know what I said earlier about hope and hopelessness, but hey, I can be contradictory too. But let me the lessons from here and from South Africa. I mean, I see legal action happening on behalf of the poor families who've lost loved ones at the hands of police shootings and the terrible racism and so on. But I think what I really would love to see is some coordination across all of the wonderful legal expertise that there are, and all of the wonderful NGOs and activist organizations that have legal purchase on the US Constitution and the breaches that these shootings have made on that Constitution, and some kind of, not individual cases against individual police officers or police forces, but a coordinated kind of class action taken to the constitutional level that will drive some kind of change and actually expose and establish legally the institutionalization of racism that is present in the United States. We've seen that happen to some extent in England with the Stephen Lawrence case, where the police were found to be institutionally racist. And that's been a very important legal judgment. And it's been used by various activist organizations. But those kinds of things that you're not looking at one team of lawyers on behalf of one family, but class actions right across. And I think strategically, that is something that I would really like to see more happening in the United States. And I think allied to that, and almost as important as that, is the Black Lives Matter movement somehow to harness the energy that is currently spilling out onto the streets in the form of violence. And that's a strategic problem, because I think that kind of unharnessed and for the frustration that's been expressed in that violence is doing damage to the movement. And I'm not a pacifist by any means, but I think that the frustration that's been demonstrated there needs to be somehow brought on board strategically. And people need to understand what it is they're doing and what the direction of travel must be and what kind of actions are going to serve that direction of travel. And it seems to me that that's a bit of a lacuna at the moment. And then finally, and probably most importantly, which is, I think, what we're doing here, but also what all sorts of people are doing in their lives as teachers, as lawyers, as plumbers, as electricians. If you know any, please send them my way. You know, all people doing it in their daily lives, and that is to make the weather, to work for a climate change, not for the environment, but actually for the climate of racism that we live in. So that actually the acts that we do every day is we're making the weather. And I mean, we had to do that in South Africa. We did that all over the world on behalf of South Africa. We boycotted goods. We spoke up. We challenged. We wrote. We went on television and said things. We went on the radio. We went on the streets. We made up theater. We wrote poetry. All of these actions that actually create momentum that weaves into the fabric of society, something that people can then stand on when they're beginning to push forward and change. So those are my 4 thoughts on my big drive today. I don't know if they're of any value, but it's kind of, and it's all of them. It's not just one thing, but it has to be somehow everything all at once. Because I think what we're up against is so insidious and so ubiquitous that we've got to actually take action where we are, but also thinking strategically and keeping some kind of idea that this can lead somewhere. I kind of share your thoughts about what we're leaving behind in the future. And I also do feel that we really have we need to have a sense of urgency about this kind of work at the moment, because really the world is not in a good state. I mean, in many ways, the pandemic is about a real virus, but it's also a metaphor for what's going on in the world. And that's, I think, a terribly damning situation for all of us to be in.
Thank you very much, Marie.
Yes, thank you. So there's several things. So I'm gonna be succinct here because I want to know what Dr. Keesee is brewing up over there. So one, I think to the point around John, your point, Anne Marie's point about personal power and responsibility, right? But that's not enough. But what's funny about it is it seems in some ways very basic, but it's a step that everybody skips. You know, everyone wants to change structures and systems and institutions, but no one wants to look in the mirror, right? And so if we, you know, when we talk about the changing the climate, part of it is acknowledging that we as people are part of the climate that needs to be changed. And so there are some foundational ideas that we have about the world and how it works and people and how they work and who they are and how they're supposed to be that are problematic. And in many ways, it's lazy thinking, right? It's extra lazy thinking. It's convenient. It's you know, well-worn trails that you can just kind of follow. And the you know, just to insert a little nerdiness, as I can't help but to do as a nerd. You know, John and I have in the team have often talked about, you know, Keegan and his spectrum of human development. And there's a part of the spectrum that kind of sits right in the middle called the socialized mind. And it's where most people kind of can live and die and never make it out of that part of their human development. And so I think it's a huge opportunity that we're not taking up. It's almost like the same idea of, in many ways, when we at All Aces talk about being a disruptor, in the philosophy of like, well, you have to disrupt yourself first before you can disrupt anybody else, right? It's the same thing even when it comes to activism, right? Like activism isn't just protesting in the streets. Activism, much like climate, is, you know, a practice, a way of living, a way of being every day. How you understand yourself, how you impact other people, how you engage with other people. And then when it comes to organizations, right? Being able to own the fact that there's also a collective responsibility in organizations across the people who are in the organizations, right? We did a workshop a couple months ago now with a government agency, and it was a department within a larger government agency, and then several departments within a larger government organization at the local level. And there was this kind of apathy and hopelessness and helplessness because, but it's the system and the structure and the unions and this, and we can't do this, and we can't. There was, every door opened up another can't. And so, finally had to ask the question, well, what's going to get you to what you can do? Right? Like, how do we have a conversation about what you can do? So yes, I know there's a lot of things that are hard to do in government because it's real. You never have enough time. You never have enough resources. You never have enough of anything really. But you have these huge jobs and a commitment of service to people in the jurisdictions that you serve. And so how do we get to a place where we're getting creative and we're owning our power as individuals and collectively when we're in groups, even within organizations? So concrete example would be, okay, fine. So you can't give people promotions because they're doing a good job, but that's not the main driving force behind what motivates people. Right. And so people want to be developed. This is what the research shows. People want to be developed. They want to know that the people that they work with and work for care about them. They want to know that that they're going to get development opportunities. They're going to be coached. Like, these are the things people like that keep people in organizations, keep them from running away. And so an alternative to focusing on promotion, right, is, well, what are the ways you can recognize people for their hard work, right? Let's get creative about that. What are the ways that you might not be able to give someone a promotion, but maybe there's, a development opportunity where they can maybe work on a project that allows them to get more visibility in the organization. What are the ways that we can help people be better and do better? And it's when I tell that story. I probably gave way too many details, but I use that story as kind of what we need to be doing individually and collectively within our spheres of influence, and stop giving up our power and our agency and just kind of, following that well-worn trail. Let's just do what folks have always done because that's the way it was always done. And it's a guaranteed recipe to produce inequities without realizing that that's what we're doing. It's a guaranteed recipe to reinforce oppression and do things that are oppressive to people at a systemic level and at an individual interpersonal level when we don't mean to. And so the last thing I'll say is, I think even in the context of the larger geopolitical world and stage, I also know that a couple of things, that this is not the first time in history we've been here, right? We have struggled as a society for America, also as a global society with kind of polarization. And so the opportunity, I think, in all of this, if you can call it that, is to look at, well, how did we get out of it in previous times, right? Like this rut. And also recognizing that it's not the full story, right? Like, we live in a in a time where we have instant access to information and to 24/7 news cycle, and usually what you're getting in those worlds, social media and this 24/7 news cycle, is the extremes. You get the worst, the most awful, the loudest voices, but it's not necessarily representative of everybody. It's actually mostly representative of the extremes, where the rest of us are watching this mess and we're like, what is wrong with these people? Right. And so just for reframing and just context, like it feels overwhelming because it's coming at us all day long through all these different mediums. It's if we're only dialed into that, it can be super overwhelming. And it is overwhelming. And there's a lot happening in communities that's the complete and total opposite story. That's about people working together. That's about people working through differences in order to see our common humanity, and the complexity of the fact that we also have different realities, and both can be true. And folks being able to figure out innovative ways forward. And so I think that's what gives me hope, is being able to kind of search for those nuggets out here in the world, because there's more than we realize. It's just not newsworthy, right? No one wants to talk about the good news. I heard an anecdote. I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard an anecdote. This is probably like 20 years ago, about a newspaper in California tried to only do a newspaper about good news. And they went out of business in like the first year because nobody wanted to read about only good news. And so it just,
nothing exciting about that.
So Dr. Keesee.
I'm looking right at you going like, I know you weren't in my meeting yesterday, but you were in my meeting yesterday. So I want to go back though to something that you said, and where people seem to be stuck is probably not a good word, but they're still here in this moment from the personal. And the concept that keeps coming up, much like you're talking about the self-work, is decolonization. It is, how are you helping people understand historical oppression and that worldview, and how you take that in and you actually reproduce and you keep doing things to reaffirm what you believe are okay, but technically are really not okay for you. But I think a lot of folks have underestimated the personal here. And I agree with you. I think they absolutely did. Because when you're talking about policing, you're often looking at the organization itself. You'll hear conversations about culture. You'll hear, the chief gets fired, or you remove the chief and you pop another one up in there, hoping that that's going to make it even better. But no one is dealing with the individual level of folks who've made the decision to do this job and what they bring with them when they do that job. And so, as I was telling other folks, if you make your decisions by listening to sound bites, you will always be able to find something to reaffirm what you believe. And right now, everybody's on the emotional extremes about what they believe to be true. And so what I'm not finding, though, is folks that are living in the seams, like most of us are, who are doing this, who have to carry both of those houses and then some to figure out where do we bridge and where do we come in and do this. What I'm not finding is that personal level work. And that's why I keep saying, without some type of contemplative care, without people really stopping for a minute and saying, okay, where are you really truly situated here in doing this? And I'm going to lift up Dr. Acosta's work around this history and really understanding where you come in and really what's been laid bare for you to digest based on somebody else's perspective about how you should be viewing yourself. And so it's really, the work is there is this disentanglement piece that has to go on. But you can't, and I mentioned this to the group the other day, we used to try to, from a structure perspective, tell people to leave your personal problems at the door when you come to work. Do not bring that in here, focus on your work. We have hit that point, and I think this is something that I liked about what Marie said, we have hit that point now where those things are no longer holding up. And they are really pushing and putting stress against organizations and people and pressures to do something. And now we find people who don't know how to do that because we spent decades saying, don't do that. Don't bring it in here because we don't want to manage it. Or we've managed it by either disciplining it or calling it something that it wasn't. And so we sort of laid that groundwork and that piece down too. One of the things that policing is really struggling right now is its own identity. That's what this is really about. It is about who are you and what are you supposed to be. That power piece has not really been allowed to be shifted because what community has wanted has been very surface level. This is why community policing has become problematic, because a lot of folks believe that community policing was that trusting relationship where I could do things and you would trust me. And when you know, there's trusting relationships of all kind. And as I've told lots of folks, I said, you know, I don't know about you, but when you trust people, you trust don't set your house on fire. They don't burn your car. If you have a relationship and if you understand what's going on the ground, this is aside from people who are expressing in different ways that we don't all necessarily agree with, but understand the core of where it's coming from. And there's never really been, in a sense, a sort of training around community policing has come up so many times. And I have to remind people, you define community in so many different ways. And you never ask the community itself, how do they see themselves and how do they fit into that picture? And so what we've done is we've allowed these sort of concepts, taglines, or whatever to infiltrate what really needs to happen in the work. Implicit bias training, community policing. All those things do not get to what needs to happen here. And I've told these people a million times that I don't care what kind of training you're going to do. You got to start with the individual. You need to understand where they're living, what they're bringing, and how they are managing what's going on around them. And so, you know, when I'm snapping under the table because I didn't want to go all off on the deep end, but I know this to be true, that we have allowed for far too long for folks to try to bifurcate themselves and say, I can't be here there, I gotta be here over here. And you're seeing that tension and that clash coming full bore on top of everything else. And this is, and I'll give you the example, the clearest example I can give you from American culture is if folks that worked for the company who owns Aunt Jemima, if you don't think that those employees have said to them thousands of times, do something about this brand, and folks have looked at them and, you know, and probably went straight to the bottom line, like still selling good, people aren't complaining, for all of a sudden now to say, we're going to do something. We're going to do something with Uncle Ben. And to wonder why people are not taking you at your word, that this surface level performance is not cutting it. And so it is really the work I'm finding is where we were not doing individual level and really focusing on organizational is now where it's even, the tension's even more tight, right? Because now people they feel a certain way, they're having certain feelings about certain things, yet we don't want them to bring that to work because it was already there. That's why we have organizations that are struggling. That's why we have departments that are struggling, because it was already there. And we've managed to sort of separate things out and compartmentalize things. And even the health, and that's why I said that the health of the individual, psychologically, physically, is so much a part of all of this work. And how do you collectively begin to address something like that when people are coming from different levels, different experiences, different generations? That's what I'm wanting to learn from the geopolitical space who people have gone through it. Because you've got you can say Black Lives Matter, you got young kids who are aware, and you got their grandparents who tell them you need to stop that foolishness and get back in the house. And you have to do this work at home, at work, and at school. And so I'm interested to hear how these long held, just horrific things that have happened around the world, how are you doing, or how did you do this collective healing? Because a lot of this work is not going to sustain itself if we don't begin some type of collective healing around the individual as well as the collective.
I recall talking with Marie about how, there's lawsuits and there's, there's court hearings for people who have done wrong, but it never replaces the loss of a life. It never replaces that hole that's left in a community. And, we talked about truth and reconciliation as a road in that direction, but it does, people keep chasing for something that they never quite get. And that is to replace that hole that was that was made through these policies, through these practices, behaviors, through the losses because of those things. And so I'm curious as well, Dr. Keesee, lessons learned, things that you've seen.
You know, I mean, I'm going to say something, and I hope you understand that I'm saying this because it seems to me to be important to understand this. And I mean, I understand people's desire to heal at an individual level and to understand and to feel better. But for me, looking on from the outside, I don't think healing is possible until the septic wound that is festering in the United States is lanced and some of that terrible poison is released. And I honestly feel, I mean, and I understand that people are in pain and they've lost loved ones and they want to heal, but actually, you know, I wonder whether actually the drive for change must take priority first, and that people have to accept pain and suffering in the short term in order to turn around some of the very difficult things that are in place in your society and in ours. I mean, it's the same. We don't have exactly the same situation, but we have parallel situations with refugees and asylum seekers and with all sorts of other terrible oppressions here. And racism, of course, is ubiquitous in right across the world, but it takes a specific form there. And I mean, I mean, one of the things that I think is so clear to me is the importance of collective action, of people coming together and thinking things through and putting plans and strategies in place collectively, because actually that act of working collectively with other people for change is healing in itself. It generates hope, it generates energy, and it generates a momentum that allows people to breathe slightly differently. And it also generates solidarity and bonds of friendship and all sorts of things that actually can act in a healing way. But we don't set healing as our priority. We set change as our priority. And through actively seeking change collectively, healing happens. But healing's not the primary goal. Change is the primary goal. And that's what's kind of staring at me at the moment. I don't know whether that makes sense to anybody else.
It makes sense. And I appreciate that perspective. And I think that the way race has shown up here, historically legislated, enforced, continues to be, there is one of, as I can tell you, as you know, much like as a woman of color, the pain piece for me is how much, how long, and how long are we willing to allow people to suffer? And I think that is one of the bigger questions, right? So it's not even for me, it's, you know, I think it's important to, if you have to get justice any way you can, whether you're suing somebody to get that piece taken care of, but it is the persistent pain, the persistent trauma, and it's not post. I have to, you know, I had a great conversation over the weekend. It's like, this is not post anything. This is just compounded. And so the question then becomes one of, and I like what you said, and I think what we as a people, and I'll speak only for myself, what I struggle with is this pain has gone on for so long. How much more do we ask people to do? My mother will be 80 in December and has learned to compartmentalize historical things so she can just function. And you know, how long do you have to be dysfunctional to get change? Because even that change at some point becomes dysfunctional because of the way that you are, I'm assuming, put together or thinking about it. So that's what I appreciate about your perspective. There are trade-offs. I think there are trade-offs. And I think what you hear people struggling with is that trade-off. How long does a group of people have to be in pain and to suffer for change? You know, and you know, activists will tell you it's over, it's done. There's no more. We're not doing this anymore. And that's the reason why you see such difficulty with people coming right to the table. It's pure exhaustion. What's doing it? And that's
Yeah.
why it shows up the way it shows up in the street. That's the way it shows up in council meetings, and public meetings. It's like they're done. And how long do you generationally tell your children and grandchildren to hold on and wait? That's where we're really up against. It's like we're running out of time. You run out, and we'll have young kids, so you've run out of time. There's not running. You've run out of time. And so I appreciate that. It's that struggle. How do you do that struggle? So thank you for that. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Dr. Keesee, for that. And I actually, Rebecca Rosenblum, who's been posting in the comments, actually stole my thunder. Good to see you, Rebecca. But part of it is it's not mutually exclusive, right? And so one of the things that I've learned from working in emergency management and having to coordinate the human services side of it, in addition to other things, but like the when you start to see the impact of deep trauma and people kind of that's acute in the moment, and the things that are helpful to them in terms of healing and being able to move forward, is a focus on the action, practical things in front of them. What can we do to address these very specific things that are moving, that we have to do in order to recreate in I guess, for lack of better terms, to kind of get back into or get back closer to who we are. And I think, it's from all of those experiences of, there's a practice called psychological first aid, and there are other deeper practices. And, Rebecca is a practitioner of one form, of many forms that support people through trauma, EMDR, eye movement desensitization, something. Rebecca, put it in the comments. What's the R stand for? But at any rate, but this idea that from all of that, what I've learned is that the healing is in the doing, right? And that if we only focus on what's happening to us from a passive perspective as a bystander, then it kind of fuels this, it fuels that hopelessness and helplessness we were talking about earlier. And one of the things that's been helpful for me and personally and professionally has been looking at the sense and reprocessing. Thank you, Rebecca. But looking at issues and figuring out what action can I take in this moment? What is it that I can actually do? And sometimes the doing is, I'm going to remove myself from the situation. And if that's the only action I can take, is still an action. Sometimes the action is, I'm just not going to engage. Sometimes the action is, we need to get together. And this is where the most powerful action happens, to Marie's point about collective action. When we get together as people and figure out how do we leverage what we have in these moments in order across a group, in order to really to focus on the things that we can do, that we can shift. That for me has been probably in my world life-saving, right? I often don't talk a lot about like personal stuff and all that, and I'm not going to get into personal stuff here, but what I will say is that I've seen a lot of tragedy and trauma and crazy stuff in my life, both personally experienced and what I've seen other people have to experience. And so that vicarious connection. And for me, what has helped me still stay a healthy human being in all of that is figuring out the things that I can do and focusing my energy there. It actually isn't just healing. It also, from a mental health perspective, from a power perspective, kind of feeds into that, right? Like when you start to take action, it's like, I did something, right? Like I didn't just sit there and like watch things unfold. I said something, right? I took a position in a moment where it mattered. I surfaced the hypocrisy in the stupidity of the situation, which is what racism usually surfaces in most instances, is like the hypocrisy and the ridiculousness. And it actually, I want to go back to something that I think is, I mentioned it earlier, but I want to be really specific about this because, you know, I've had several clients say this to me, leaders in organizations say this to me, and I'm very concerned about it as the only road. And this leader most recently, and several others before this leader, have said to me, well, it's really too hard to change people, which is how they reframe it, to change people. So instead, I'm just going to institute policies that restrict things that people can do so that, you know, you either get with it or you don't. Now, to your point earlier, Dr. Keesee, that's hugely problematic because what ends up happening when we do that, it becomes a checkbox. I don't even understand why we're doing this stupid thing. It becomes another sheet of paper amongst the stack of sheet of papers that folks just check off. And so when we talk about healing as individuals and collectively as individuals, it also includes organizations. Like there is a such thing as organizational trauma. It's a whole field of practice, and people study it. And I think in that same vein as the opportunities for individuals where the healing is in the doing, it's the same thing for organizations. The healing is in the doing. Stop reacting, start responding from a strategic perspective. And if you haven't responded before in a strategic perspective and you don't even know what that means, use these moments as a catalyst to learn what that means and to get on that journey. Because when we don't take action and we don't influence or try to influence or change the things that are actually right in our spheres of influence, and in sometimes control, then it reinforces those feelings of going back to powerlessness and hopelessness. And then we just, only things that we see is what everybody else is doing, which seems innovative, but really is mostly status quo stuff. And so I share that as a both personal, professional, kind of and organizationally, the overlap of where we have opportunities that we're not taking advantage of to heal in meaningful ways. Because, you know, I don't know about other people, but I'm tired of talking.
Ashok, you invited a couple
Say that
opposing
again?
sides to dinner, I think, once to get them to.
Yeah.
Ashok talked about bringing
Well,
two different people just
John,
to have
two
dinner
things.
together one time.
One, yes, and it's not a couple of times. I do this all the time, and I am friends with people I thoroughly disagree with. In fact, I tell them very clearly, I hate your ideas, and in fact, if the world becomes the way you want it to be, we will all be terribly off. And I love you as people, and come home for dinner. So this is not something I do rarely. I do it all the time. But I wanted to pick up on something that Marie said about the tension between healing and change. I want to pick up on the change part. And I come to this because as someone who has through most of my life been an extreme liberal, an extreme left-centric person, it is only in the last 10 years or so that I have started realizing how narrow even that perspective is. And so here's my question for this group. We talk about change so much, and it's because it's needed. There's no getting away from it. There are so many things that need to change. But what are some of the things we need to preserve? And I'm really, really disappointed when I hear the discourse the public discourse, particularly amongst my friends and peers who are so gung-ho about change, whether it's systemic change or even personal change, very few want to pay attention to what human beings, particularly from our societies, because I'm not talking again of Saudi Arabia, from our societies, what we have done well and what we need to hold on to, not just improve. Change and improvement is something that is, for me as an Easterner, it's a very American idea. The idea of unceasing progress, unceasing change, unceasing innovation. And it's lovely. I love it. I'm a product of that in a way, because I'm intellectually and emotionally more Western than Eastern. But I grew up in the East. And I really wonder what it is that we are missing out if we can't find anything to preserve. So I'm just going to leave it there.
Ashok, so did I miss the memo where you're the host, you're the moderator today? You just throwing all the questions out there at us.
Oh, I thought that was. I thought that was for chatting with the host and other guests. So I would start chatting with the host.
I'm teasing.
I super appreciated your paradigm shift, Ashok.
I love it.
Yeah, but you know what? I really was wondering how to get my question in without interrupting you folks when you were talking so beautifully. I thought I was being sensitive by putting it on the corner there.
It's all good. I was joking.
I know. But this is a message for Miles. Do help me, because I don't like interrupting any of you when you are talking. So this is a way for me to kind of do this gently.
Thank you.
But my question is something that I want to do out there. Sorry?
Because it's a critical question, Ashok. It's absolutely a critical question. Because what's happening even in policing is we talk about defunding and we talk about abolishing, clearly understand where that is grounded. But what's not being answered is what's the interim for those who are suffering? What do you do for people who need things? And there are some of those systems that have proven to work. The better systems are closer to the ground in communities. And are we saying, same example, when we say abolish the police, are we saying abolish service that is needed? And what are we really trying to get rid of? Is it the behavior of the people and how that interaction has happened? Or are there things about that work that do get held onto that work? And I think part of answering that question about what do we preserve, at least for me, is that can you preserve parts or can you preserve things that have a underlying start in the problem, right? Slave patrols, enforcing segregation. What parts of those things and systems do you preserve? And how do you make those decisions? Because that's what's at play here too. It's not just, abolish, defund. Is the question being asked by lots of at least government is, what do we keep? Do we keep anything? And so I think I loved your question. I think that's it. That is absolutely it. And that's the hard part. That's harder than saying let's change because you can just get rid of everything. The hard part is, can we not only identify what to keep, but defend it? Because also what's happening here is the inability to defend what you think is working. That's what's also. So I loved your question and your takeover from John. I thought that was brilliant.
Thank you.
Marie, I see the glasses coming off.
Yeah, I'm thinking. My glasses come off, and I'm thinking because it helps if you can't see anything.
Yeah.
What do you keep? Gosh, I think we keep things without even meaning to. Is the problem? Essentially, we're conservative people, and institutions are conservative, and they're going to fight to keep things the same. And so I guess and we'll do things. So for example, there are established ways in which we try to figure things out or to do things. So right now, we're now in an age where people are suddenly Skyping or Zooming or what are we calling this today? Some other platform, yet another platform. All of these. This is the new way that we're doing things, and that'll become institutionalized, and we'll have ways of doing things that are established, and we'll keep those things even past their sell-by date. So I'm less worried about what we keep. I mean, I think there are values that we want to keep, and we know what those. I think we know what those are, about respect and dialogue, and understanding difference, and the responsibility we have to educate ourselves and hold ourselves accountable. So I think there are values that we can hang on to, but I think my worry is that we go down well-trodden paths. Because we are essentially conservative in our behaviors, and we tend to do the same thing over again, even though we know we want a different outcome. And so I'm less worried about what we keep than how the hell do we get ourselves that rocket up the ass that we need to do things differently. And that's, I think, that's the worry that I have, but, I'm just living here with sheep. I don't worry much anymore. But I know that, I mean, I think that a principle for me is the principle of collective action. There is no damn use in the world and me sitting here in West Donegal thinking deep thoughts unless I do something with them, unless I write them down and put them on a blog and send them out to the world. Doing things for myself at an individual level is going to change nothing. And you know what? I'm going to be dead soon anyway. So, what have I got to do? I have to do it collectively. I have to do it with other people, because that way there's a force multiplier, and also we leave things behind with other people that they can take forward.
Only thing I'll add to the conversation is I think there's a difference between the words we use and what we do. And change and innovation are words we use a lot in America, and we only do them in certain contexts, or are willing to do them in certain contexts. So we love innovation in technology, right? We love innovation in, really just in technology. No, I'm just joking. In business processes and in these very kind of non-human things. But when it comes to the systems and us as people and our role in the systems as cogs in the system, in the organizations and the decisions we make and all of the stuff, I think innovation and change has been mostly lip service in terms of what folks are what they say and what we do. And I think there are things to preserve. And I think even what we decide to preserve has to be innovated and reimagined because of where they came from and how the genesis of them, like how they came to be. Right. And so even if we think about the values of America, right? Truth, justice, liberty, all these things, like all of those words were crafted in a time where there were slaves, people who were enslaved. There were people who weren't allowed to do things because of their gender. There were like all of these things from a class perspective. There were all of these realities of injustices that were happening at the same time. We were talking about justice and liberty and all of these other things as a country. And so I think there are these foundational principles and values that we can preserve, but we have to reimagine together, to Marie's point about collective action, what they mean now. And this is an iterative process. In every culture, every generation will get stale if we don't look at, well, what are the things that we're holding on to that might not be relevant to what we're dealing with today? And how do we do that in a way where we don't lose ourselves, where we don't lose our culture foundations, right? And we're being honest about the realities of today and what we've learned, and how do we apply that to where we're trying to go. And that requires a collective conversation that we haven't had as a society, and even internationally. So I just share that very quickly. And then the last piece I'll add to that is kind of the role of identity in all of that. Right. Dr. Keesee brought this up earlier. I think it was Dr. Keesee. You brought it up earlier, right? I think identity is so tricky because we think of it very narrowly. And when we think of it very narrowly, it's easy to feel, it's easy to internalize attacks on that one identity that you only identify with, right? So if I'm a police officer and my whole life, everything I've poured into only being a police officer, I have never developed any other aspects of my life or interests or anything, then that narrow perspective of my identity then becomes something that I will fight tooth and nail against anyone trying to insert any innovation, even if we're having a conversation about what we preserve at the same time. And I think for us in our human development, for us to explore more of who we are, that identity piece, like who are you though? What do you, not just what you believe, but why do you even believe that? Where did you get that from? How do we, I wish we had classes in school like that taught us about ourselves, right? Like, this is why people do the stupid things they do. And so you shouldn't do these things because, you'll end up in these situations where you'll be embarrassed a lot, or where you'll be justifying things that shouldn't be justified. Decisions that you shouldn't have made, or things you said that you shouldn't have said, and you just didn't know any better, but you can just own it. But we don't learn those kinds of things about ourselves as people and why we do what we do. And then we wonder why people don't understand why we do what we do and why it's so hard to change it. And I'll just say, from a resources perspective, one of my favorite books on the matter is this one. I had to grab it earlier. So it's called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me. Yep. So John, I recommended John get his own copy. And the subtitle is Why We Justify Foolish Beliefs, Bad Decisions, and Hurtful Acts. And so for part of this, this piece around identity at a foundational level, separate from race and racism, us being clear about who we are and the values that we hold and the beliefs that we hold and why, and being able to articulate them in a way that's not just a regurgitation of what you heard somebody else say, but a position you actually arrived at because you went through your own process. And one of the things that I appreciate about this particular book is they talk about this idea of kind of the Americans, and it's not just an American thing, it's a human thing, but it's heightened in America, I guess. There's 3 acts to a play, right? The first act is kind of just the setup, right? This is the background, this is the context, this is, the stuff, the character development part. The third act is the resolution, right? You arrive at the outcome of whatever the struggle is. And act 2 in the middle is the struggle, right? And it's like, nobody wants to go through the struggle part. We just want to skip from act 1 to act 3 and magically everything is better. And we have to go through that middle part. And the idea is, how do we do it in a way that's productive, right? How do we do it in a way that is respectful in a shared understanding of what respectful means, and not just one group's perspective on what respect is. So I'll stop there with one exception, except to acknowledge that Vincent Davis also posted in the chat earlier on in the conversation about the shooting in Kenosha is yet another indication that little has changed. Law enforcement is still in denial mode and running a sympathy campaign. And so shout out to Vincent Davis, certified emergency manager, brilliant person, activist in the emergency management field. And I just want to acknowledge something that Doc Rivers said. I don't know if folks have seen the interview with Doc Rivers, from basketball. And he talked about how it's hard for him to wrap his brain around the fact that we keep loving this country as Black people, and it doesn't love us back. And the hypocrisy of fear being used as a reason why law enforcement gets to walk away from things, but Black people can't be fearful. You're not allowed to have fear, right? It gets to kind of that hypocrisy of racism and other forms of oppression and lack of critical thinking and all that stuff. But I want to highlight that connection to Vincent's point, where you have in the situation fear being used as a motivator behind what law enforcement can do and get away with. And Black people can never be scared. Like we're just supposed to be, I don't know, superheroes or something and show up every day and never be able to be scared either. And even though all of the evidence, it says you should be scared. So I just wanted to bring that up as we transition.
I just want to pick on what Dr. Atyia said. That's pretty heartbreaking, that sentence, that line, and I've heard it before. And every time I hear it, that we are expected as Black people to love the country, and we love the country, but the country doesn't love us back. That's just, I don't know how else to put it. It's heartbreaking. Thank you for sharing that again.
Thank you, Ashok. When you talked about what to preserve, that's what got me into my racial equity journey. Is I was having a really hard time reconciling that I would stand by victims. I would protect people and be a voice for people who needed me to be strong for them. And yet there was this other thing happening in the world that unarmed Black men and women were being killed. And I really struggled with that. And it's what cracked me open and started my journey into that. And one of my learnings in that time was about how many soldiers, Black soldiers, went and fought in World War II and came back. They gave their lives and then came back and were not given the same things that white GIs were, and redlining and the GI Bill and its limitations. And I began to learn about just systems of oppression, and that's nothing I had to live with. I'm a white man, but I began to see and know and start to understand the systems that I was actually participating in, whether I knew it or not. And we would call that being a passive conductor of racism, when you're not aware that the system that you are in also oppresses people and you're participating in it without knowing. And I have nothing more to say about that.
I mean, it's interesting you should bring that up, John, because this is part of what's at the heart of what's going on right now in policing, right? So you have the example that you gave about Black soldiers, and it wasn't just soldiers, it was everywhere. Doing their work and then coming back on behalf of loving the country, and then coming back to find out you are not even afforded a human level experience around that. And this is where I know a lot of folks that I'm doing this work with, this is what's hard for people to get past. That this is not hidden history, this is lived history. And so this is where people are struggling. And it's not that, your journey is, and I appreciate that your journey is your journey, but when I'm in a room full of cops, white cops, that are absolutely just livid, that folks keep bringing up the fact that policing was based on slave patrols, that there's discrimination, that there's complicity in not speaking and not seeing, that's where all of that gets really messy. And I'm not saying, you know, your journey is your journey, and I appreciate that. But when you don't even allow yourself or I should say, you can't even wrap your mind around the fact, a little bit about what you just said, that we've been occupying the same space but living two different lives. And it is as simple as recently as Juneteenth. You know, you have people who are like, well, how do you not know that there's 4 million people celebrating this one event? And most of them worked the event because there's a parade or a party of some sort and not know what that signifies. I struggle to get community to get past that part. It's like we have been living here and these things have been happening. And I tell you, the thing that sort of was a trigger for me is words like the veil's been lifted. I'm like, no, this is real life in the flesh happening. And that's where a lot of the struggle is when we want to try to figure out what's next steps and how do we move forward, because people are really having a hard time wrapping their minds around that all these things historically have happened. And for a large group of people to say no, it doesn't bode well. And I can tell you, a lot of folks, this is why a lot of people are not want to have this conversation, because there's absolutely no belief and trust in that. Because what was going on benefited a group of people. And so there is a struggle here with, you know, in reality, you know, when I talk to the cops, they're struggling. They're struggling with that. And folks of color are just beside themselves with this and really don't want to give any more energy to it. But I'll tell you this, it feels this way to me that, you know, maybe not all, and I never say all, and nothing's absolute. Most of them truly had no clue in some sense. Not whether you believe it or not, but there are some things they just absolutely didn't know. And I had a conversation with one chief who really, in his way of trying to have a conversation with community, you know, and this is the other thing that they're very fearful of, try to engage in a conversation which he felt was heartfelt and trying to come up with a solution, and it offended half the room. If the rules keep changing and they don't know what language to use and they don't know what's appropriate and they know what's not, part of that process is to begin to pull back and just say, I don't know, I guess, right? And but when you get to the point where whatever comes out of your mouth might be offensive to someone and you don't even know where to start, that's what we're trying to figure out. How are we going to help people process that? Not that it's good or bad, it's a reality. And this is the reality of the space we're in right now. And the common language, the common understanding about what's happening, all of those things are critical in this moment right now. And everybody's got to be engaged. But the rules of engagement is what has some people really paralyzed right now. And it's generational, some of it, not all of it. And so it has sort of set up the space where we're in right now. And we are all, maybe not all of us, but most of us are trying to maneuver this. How do you get people to come over here and understand it without burdening other people, so we can get some work done? And it's really that, I mean, that's where we're at. My majority of my conversations about how do we do this, from the wanting to rush through this pain point to really wanting to get into deep dialogue where other folks don't want to have a dialogue. You know, nobody says easy, but you know, you certainly don't want to, and we might have to be, and if that's all right too, we have to manage the expectations of how long this process truly is going to take. And my fear is, and I'll go back to what Marie said about leadership and elections. I don't know what it's going to look like on November 4th. I just don't. I have no clue. I have all, I can tell you this, my gut is saying brace for it, whatever that it is going to be. And that's the reality of what's happening on the streets for cops right now. And so it's really, really an interesting sort of a place to try to work all of those things that we've been talking about, identity and preserving, you know, what do we preserve, what do we move forward? And I'm going to go back only because I love the way Marie comes at things. The question really becomes one of, has this system we've been living in that we think on behalf of the other is collapsing? And it was collapsing because it was never built on a strong foundation to begin with. And so it's all of those things and more. Mm-hmm. But we move on. and continue the work.
Thank you for that, Dr. Keesee. I'm going to be quiet and let someone else speak.
I was curious who has seen people really successfully find their agency in some places in this conversation. Marie talked about people binding together. At All Aces, we talk about it as your interdependence upon one another, that the group can do more than an individual can. And I'm curious, over the last 3 months or so, who have we seen rise and add voice and make change start to happen? I'll give one example. I know that the CEO for Sloan Valve, if you've ever used a bathroom before, it's an industrial, he was very concerned about his employees. And so he wrote to every mayor and police chief and said, I want to know what you're doing to protect my employees so they can get to work and home and have lives where they feel safe. And I don't like what I've been seeing on the news. And, and he used his place as the CEO to speak up and to hold people to account. And I think that's a powerful message when people who have positions of power choose to use them to be a voice and add agency to a conversation that we all need to have.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what Dr. Keesee said about like the challenge people have with even entering into the necessary discomfort and conversations that will get you to progress and evolution and relationships and all the stuff that we're looking for. One of the things that popped in my head was, well, where does that anger come from? Like, where does the frustration come from, right? And if I'm tapping into all of the nerdiness, the place where I land most logically from me is two things. One, earlier I said that I wish in school we learned about just who we are, like why we do what we do as people. Like what is this thing about us and how we do things and why we do things. The other thing that I often talk about that I think is an opportunity is racial equity literacy, right? Which includes the historical context, because we don't learn it in school. That's another thing we don't learn in school. And I'm not beating up the education system, but it needs some work because we don't learn that in school. We learn the sanitized, make most white people feel comfortable versions of history. And in absence of understanding the historical context, you have no idea how we even got here. Like none of this makes sense to you, right? It's like that historical context, there hasn't been an issue or a challenge or an injustice or an equity issue area that I have looked at that did not have a whole series of historical stories that explained that thing, why it looks the way it looks today. Even things that seem, obscure and random. There's a whole series of fellow nerds who have been studying it their whole lives, right? Include clinical trials, right? We're talking about vaccines right now, clinical trials. There are people who just study the history behind how awful that's gone throughout our history, not just in America, but internationally. And so the power of history in this context of, well, why do people feel so angry? Like one part of it is, I know for me, I was kind of embarrassed that I didn't know these things like that as I was learning them. Like I learned real history after I left school. Right. And it's an embarrassing process to see like there's this whole world that's so much bigger than what you actually learned that you didn't know. And it felt even worse as a Black person, because I'm like, I should know this stuff, right? And unless your parents knew it, that history, and they learned it and taught it to you, then you just don't know. And then the other half is, as I think about like the anger, goes back to that, what was discussed about identity, right? Because we oversimplify things, overgeneralize, right? And so we've created this equation that if I acknowledge certain things, then I am admitting that I'm a bad person. Somehow there's this like equation that we've created where everything is about being a good person or a bad person. Whereas ultimately we're just people, and we do good stuff and we do bad stuff, and none of us is perfect. No organization is perfect. And from an identity perspective, if we're holding on to this kind of Disney version of what being a human being is, and we dichotomize everything, good or bad, ugly or beautiful, this very extreme way of organizing the world, and simple way of organizing the world, then if my identity is caught up in this warped perception, then anything that takes away from my identity, what I think about myself, makes me furious. I don't even know why I'm mad. I'm uncomfortable. I'm all kinds of emotions. It usually comes out as anger, but I'm all kinds of messed up. And one of the things from a resources perspective, like if we think about, well, what do we do about all this stuff, right? Like this stuff is real. We got there's a lot that needs to get done, and sooner rather than later, even though we know this is a journey, this is a process, but there's a lot that can happen like tomorrow if we wanted to. And that is this piece around habit, right? So we've been, because of all of this stuff we've been talking about during this session, we've kind of learned a bunch of really bad habits, individually and collectively. And in thinking about, well, what do they say you're supposed to do to change your habits, right? As individuals and in organizations. First of all, what folks say is it's one of the hardest things to do to change a habit. Like it is one of the, as a human being, as an individually or in groups, it is one of the most hardest things to do is to stop doing something that we've been doing for a long time. And so the first part of it is understanding that we have to shift how we see ourselves. First, we have to reframe the problem. But in this instance, we also have to reshift how we think about ourselves around our identities, right? Because if we don't reimagine a new identity for ourselves, where we hold on to the things that are important and valuable, then what are we doing? Like, we're just kind of tinkering around the edges. And how we identify limits or expands the landscape of action that we can take. And so without going into too much detail, I'll just say two books that are my favorite around this issue. So this is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, that does a really good job of explaining the background behind all the stuff, like why our identity is so tied to how our identity gets in the way of us changing our habits on a whole spectrum of habits. And then the other one is Atomic Habits by James Clear. Oh, I know it's a little reflective, but that's how the book looks. It's kind of reflective. And that book does a good job. It provides, I think, a better framework of how do you actually do it though? Like, but how do you actually change? Like, what are the things that we need to do? And if you don't want to buy any books, James Clear actually has a newsletter you can sign up for, where he gives you basically pieces of his book every week on Thursdays. All that said, for us to really do this work well, there's some learning we have to do, preferably collectively. Social learning is the best learning. We could do the iron sharpening iron process and make some commitments and start doing things, right? I think what we've done is overanalyze, but we can't do that, and we can't do this, and can't, kind of full circle. And the goal is to figure out, but what can we do in the context? And it's amazing what happens when you get momentum, right? There's like a whole field of study around when you build momentum, that there's this direction. Once you start kind of gaining ground, you have you start influencing other people and other organizations and other groups, right? It's the reason why earlier we were talking about organizations copying other organizations, or people copying other people, just because they don't have an answer. They want to skip from act 1 to act 3. I don't want to go through that struggle part, so I'm just going to copy what everybody else is doing that's innovative, right? And so when we are able to gain traction, we actually influence those people, and they will start to take on things and go through their own process by virtue of seeing us do the work that we're doing. And so from a hopeful perspective, there's a lot of opportunities there for us. That was a lot of words. Sorry, y'all.
Dr. Martin, what did you call it when people copy each other's policies? That it's a pattern. Like somebody will write a policy, everybody needs a new policy, so they borrow that policy, and that's sort of how this perpetuates itself. And it takes people to examine why. The critical thinking piece, Ashok, that you talk about a lot. And actually, as you were talking about the discomfort of changing a habit. That's a big part of what you had mentioned earlier. Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy, who talk about the adult mind and its development. What they talk about is that pain and discomfort are what move us. Like if you're near something hot, you're going to move. And it's that same mental and emotional struggle that you go through with dealing with things that are uncomfortable. They question your identity, that if you dig into that work, it will move you and make you change. You will grow and be different as a result of going through that process. We do have about 15 minutes left. I'd be happy to spend some time if you all would like to talk about what your organizations are up to, what you're up to, resources for people to go learn more about the work that you do in particular. Feel free to jump in and let us know about the different organizations, Metaculture, Center for Policing Equity, sheep farming in Northern Ireland, whatever interests you. Please feel free to share your parting thoughts. And we're also going to have a little networking session afterwards for anyone who would like to stick around. If you'll get an opportunity to talk with some of these folks if you're able to. I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to let you all give your take.
Why we all of a sudden get really silent all of a sudden. I was actually just reading Rico's question about the cancel culture, which is so extremely appropriate when you're talking about you want all-inclusive voices, and all of a sudden someone disagrees with you and you just stop doing what you're doing. And I love that. How do you ensure that? I mean, you ensure that by hoping that folks who are trying to do that work are supported in a way you don't feel the need to have to do that kind of action to cancel. But I also find it's a very interesting culture in social media and generational. And that's the other thing. So, it shows up this way a little different. Old way used to be you just didn't invite you. That was a way of canceling out your voice. You just didn't get the invitation to go. But I think part of the challenge of when we talk about innovation, this is what we're talking about. You've got to figure out a way to get beyond. If someone doesn't agree with you, you got to keep moving for a space that will allow for some of that neutral conversation. You don't give up on having that conversation. You might have canceled this meeting, but you don't cancel the next one. You figure out a way to get that done. And I think what I don't want to have happen is that I know it doesn't feel good to have someone do that to you, but I just think that you cannot give up that easily to say, I'm just going to cancel it, because then you won't get your voice heard. You've got to figure out what's that space look like where you can bring those types of perspectives to the table, and you may have to do it another way. May not be a meeting, might be a paper, might be a video, might be a poem, might be something that gets that out. But don't let it silence. I think that's the concern around the silencing. So I don't know if that answered your question or not. But I just want to real quickly talk a little bit about the Center for Policing Equity. If you go to policingequity.org, you will see some of the tools that we've been using to work with law enforcement, and that's the roadmap to begin to assess what are the low-level efficiencies you can begin to look at. Our perspective has always been that the communities of color, specifically for me, the Black community, have to be invested in order for us to begin to rise and do the things that need to be sustained. It's not always all about money, but it is about making sure that those areas where we need to be shored up are done in that way. We work in not just with our chiefs, but we have multiple communities that we work with. And when I say that, I'm talking about academics, or the nerdy folks that we like to say, community activists, scientists, retired police officers, current chiefs. And that is really trying to do this work that is in front of us right now, and recognizing, and John, I want to mention something that you said about, I think it was mentioned too, about taking a policy and watch that policy replicate itself across other places. And it's the same thing minus a different word and a different title. In policing, we call that best practices. And what I've been telling people is that we've been practicing on people long enough. It's time for us to get to evidence base and to figure out what it is that the community needs on an individual community level, not necessarily what Seattle is doing. Denver should do the same thing. We've got to stop doing that. And that is something that we have historically been taught that was good policing. That was innovative policing, to do best practices. And so, again, for all the folks who are doing this work on the ground, I appreciate you and I appreciate your work. For the panelists, thank you. It's always such a pleasure to sit in company with you all and to get those different perspectives and to get fed, basically. I'm tired of looking at my husband every day. It's nice to see new faces. So thank you for this. I appreciate you. And the website is policingequity.org. So thank you so much, you all. And I'm going to sit by and hear all the wonderful things everyone is doing.
Okay, I'll go next. Thank you, Dr. Keesee. And this is an invitation to both Dr. Keesee and Marie. I'd love to connect with you outside of this, learn more about your work. Metaculture, I've on the chat, which wasn't supposed to be where I write, but I have written there my two websites. One is a blog, which is my personal blog, and the second is my current website. It's www.metaculture.studio. And what we have been doing, particularly since 2013, has been focusing on how to strengthen the culture of democracy. My background in critical thinking, conflict resolution, and diversity management has made me very, very, as I do not tire of saying, very, very nervous, or even on bad days, terrified about our capacity as a society to continue to move down the path of increasing openness, freedoms, and rights. My understanding of history, global history, political history, and my interest in geopolitics makes it seem very unlikely that minority rights will be enhanced over the next 20 to 40 years. It certainly looks to me and to many other commentators today that the golden days of minority rights are behind us, and that terrifies me, absolutely terrifies me. So the work we do at Metaculture is really about getting a larger perspective on how we got here. And in order to do that, we explore everything from the evolution of human societies, the evolution of political systems, the evolution of human values and human rights, and what has happened in many countries, not just the US, in terms of what happened when these rights were given, minority rights were given, or human rights were given to certain weaker populations, and the tensions that came up between those populations and the dominant groups. And coming out of that, how can we or coming out of that knowledge and understanding? How can we strategize so we don't hit a self goal now and we don't lose what we have gained through enormous sacrifice of over 100, 150 years of a lot of people? So that's really what Metaculture tries to do. Our webinars, Demo Sapiens, are becoming quite popular. All our work is very intense. The webinars are 12 sessions, 90 minutes each, and that's just level 1. So we have level 2 also of 12 sessions, and finally a master class of another 12 sessions. I am not the kind of person who has any confidence in short, quick wisdom being transferred between human beings. It's very challenging, and there's a lot of work to be done. And obviously, if anyone is interested, you may write to me or check out our website, and I'd be very happy to talk with you. Just another thing, the work we do is not about persuasion. I have given up on persuasion because I find it counterproductive. Metaculture's entire approach today is, can we help people think through this better? Think through themselves and their world better so that they can come up with the right kind of ideas, right kind of values, and the right kind of approaches that work for them and their communities. I do not preach my solutions. I do not advocate for any answers or solutions at all because I don't have them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok.
I'm going to have Marie go next as a guest.
I'm not doing anything useful at all apart from building a house at the moment. So that's my work. I'm a retired person. I'm writing, or at least I'm trying to write. And I see that as kind of what I'll be doing. But I'm also working at a community level here with people in the neighborhood, probably to set up a little local community project because we have no employment here for young people and immigration is a big problem. So that's kind of, I work at my background is in community organizing. And I think the one thing I would say is that, first of all, I would like us to dedicate ourselves to proving Ashok wrong. Okay. Because he's got this very dystopian view of the future, which I have to say, I can see where he's coming from. And, you know, I'm an older person and I do have my bleak moments as well. But I think we should set our faces against that and work to prove Ashok wrong. And I think he'd be quite pleased to be proved wrong as well. But the thing I would say is that when we set out to do anything, even if it's getting up 5 minutes earlier in the morning, you know, or to stop smoking or eating cookies or whatever, everything we do that tries to bring about change, we encounter resistance. And we can have these optimistic moments where we sit and we plan of what we're going to do and how we're going to change the world. And if we fail to plan for resistance, then we are doomed to failure. And we've got to anticipate it. We've got to factor it into our plans for the future. Because if we think it's going to be easy, then we're going to be wrong and we're going to fail. So actually encountering resistance in ourselves, but more importantly, and I keep banging on about collective action, encountering people who are the naysayers, the people who want to put the fly in the ointment, or who want to, you know, take down all of our hopes for the future. I mean, we need to have the antidote to that in our back pocket, ready to use, because we knew that this moment would come when we needed that antidote. And it's intelligent planning ahead that we actually know that by pushing against something, by trying to change something, that's something that we're trying to change is going to push back. And right now, I think we have huge things that we need to change. We need to change whole societies. We need to change whole cultures. So can you imagine the level of resistance that we're going to encounter? And so we need people who are not just developing vaccines for for coronavirus. We need people who are developing vaccines for the kind of naysaying that we will encounter in this movement to bring about change. And I think, you know, as a young woman, I didn't think about these things. I went in there all guns blazing, and I learned lessons, and I can show you scars, except it would be embarrassing because I've put on weight and I don't want to take my clothes off. But, you know, but basically, we know that there will be kickback, and we need to anticipate that and plan for it and be smart about how we set about bringing about change. I want to say finally that sitting here amongst the sheep in West Donegal, I just hope that you all have the things that sustain you to keep you going, because it's not just important for you, it's important for all of us. And the moment that you face in the United States is a historic moment. People are on the streets here in support of you, and you have to remember that. This is reverberated not just around the states of the United States, but around the world. And my cousins, my nephews and nieces are on the streets every weekend. There are no streets where I live. There's just little bog roads. So if I go out there, I look rather odd, and the wind ruins my hair. But you know, if I lived near a demonstration, I would join it. And our young people are with you, and wearing the T-shirts and carrying the banners. And you've sparked off something, as you did for us in the 1960s and 70s. Martin Luther King was one of the icons for us in Northern Ireland when we fought against the discrimination against my community. And Martin Luther King is still a great hero. His face is painted across the walls of Ireland, not just, and the walls of South Africa, and the walls of right across the world. So please remember, we're with you. Godspeed and a good wind.
Thank you, Marie. So All Aces Inc., you know, we too do not believe in changing people. That's not a thing someone can do for another person. We do believe in learning. We do believe in building knowledge, skills, and tools. And so the work that we do with organizations is half what we call proper development or professional and personal development based on a certain foundation of skills, right? Racial equity, literacy, and kind of opening the door to it, right? Because in most cases, what we know about workshops and trainings is it can be a catalyst, right? But it's not the answer. And so we're opening the door to helping folks understand that there's a much bigger historical context and picture that we need to explore beyond what we as All Aces introduce you to. And then the other important skills that we really focus on are emotional intelligence, how we understand ourselves, how we manage ourselves, how we understand other people and how we're impacting other people, as well as how we manage relationships and all of those interactions, ourselves and how we interact with other folks. Conflict management, you know, it's a skill. We have Rico on the team who has a master's degree in conflict management, and some other folks on the team who are extra interested in this area and do a lot of reading around it, because it is something we avoid, but it's something that's completely and totally necessary. And the discomfort that we feel, in addition to needing the emotional intelligence to manage ourselves and to understand how we're splashing on other people, but also being able to navigate through conflict and not run away from it. It is a habit we have as individuals that, you know, it's a habit that we have as organizations, and it's a habit that reinforces oppression, right? Because what ends up happening is the folks who are on the receiving end of injustices are then moderated in a way where they become the problem instead of the real problem being the problem. And so conflict management allows us to build those skills that helps us not to fall into those traps. The other skill is about communication, how we listen to people, how we express ourselves to other people, and how that relates to emotional intelligence. And then the third one is really about critical thinking. How do we make sure that we understand those mental pitfalls that all of us as human beings easily fall into, and being able to have a consistent process to manage our human default ways of thinking, right? Which is not rational, right? Goes back to emotional intelligence again. And so for us, that's the kind of individual work that happens in a collective way. And so, and then we also work on the organizational development side. What is it about our strategic direction that communicates or makes it clear about our commitments and our stances? But that's just one layer of many layers of organizational development. Another few I'll just point out is kind of norms and standards, right? Which is, all right, but what do we actually do every day? What are our habits? And do our habits match that strategic direction that we say that we believe in, the mission, vision, values, all those pieces? How does that impact the core equity opportunities within organizational development, which are communication on the organizational side, but it's clearly very related to the professional, personal development, the relationships. How do we create opportunities as an organization for people to build and sustain relationships with each other? And then the third one is knowledge, right? Knowledge building and sharing. Right? How do we make sure that the narrative that we tell about what's happening in the organization and the pictures that we paint about ourselves collectively is actually reflective of the complexity and the diversity of experiences in the organization, so that we're being honest about what's coming back to us in that mirror? And then the last couple ones are really about brass tacks. All right, how do we make decisions? And at what point do people in the organization get to make decisions about their own work, about the direction of the organization, and do they feel like their voice and their choice is a part of the organization in a meaningful way? And then that influences resources. How are we actually investing in equity work? What are we putting into it, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of the time and space we're creating for it, and who is at the table and who is doing the work? Is it just some people, or is it an organizational thing? And so all of that to say that we do all of those things with organizations in order to walk them through a process. And as part of that process is really about making sure that we're creating opportunities to apply the learning, right? So we're learning, we're practicing and doing, and then we're applying it to the context of the organization. How do we actually explore what this could look like here if we decided to be something different? And what are the barriers, to Marie's point, what are the barriers that we should anticipate as we are trying to not just reimagine ourselves, but actually create that reality? What are we going to bump up against, and how do we strategize around that? So that's kind of the work we do. And then one of the ways that we support folks, anyone, is through our online learning community, intentionallyact.com. So we put resources up there. Actually, the recording of this will be posted there. And the earlier someone asked, how do we get notified about more sessions like this? You can sign up on intentionallyact.com. And once you sign up, you become a part of our mailing list, and we'll make sure that you get notified. So that said, I went a little bit over. Thank you, John, for being so amazing and moderating us. You did brag on yourself a little bit, but I'm going to brag on you a little bit more and just say that John is one of the most self-aware, open people that I know. And I enjoy getting the opportunity to work with him every day. Rico behind the scenes is an amazing human being, and is one of our funniest people on the team, for reasons I can't share right now because we don't have enough time. And Miles, who is also behind the scenes, who is our amazing expert on all things social media and digital strategy. So thank you all. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, John, to close this out intentionally.
Thank you. So I'll be brief. I think there's a link posted. If you can join us after this, we'll have sort of a virtual networking session, which has been pretty popular in the past. I want to thank Marie and Tracie, Atyia, Ashok for spending 2 hours with us. It was a very, very generous donation of your time, and we're appreciative. hopefully everybody who's watching has learned something, has been moved a little bit, maybe even pushed into that discomfort zone. I think the hard thing about this work is that it's a non-closure work. It's a process. And so, that maybe we've been moved a little bit, maybe we'll dig a little deeper, maybe we'll grow some more from this. So thank you all for your time and for sharing 2 hours of your valuable life with us, and we hope that you're a little bit better for it. I know that I am. Thank you all.
Thank you, John and Dr. Atyia, and nice to meet you, Murray and Dr. Keesee.
Yes, and Ashok, I heard what you said, so we'll be in touch, okay?
Wonderful. I love that.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.